A warm welcome to everyone. I am Miranda Hickman from Poetry Matters, and I'm delighted that we're able to convene this evening for a meet together with Earthworld Collaborative, which is a Montreal-based group of musicians, artists, and writers. And what we're focusing on this evening is conversation on how the collaborative is adapting to new conditions this year during pandemic, how Earthworld's creative work and collaborative process have evolved in response to the challenges posed by COVID and in some instances, the opportunities posed by this season. So tonight they'll be sharing insights along these lines. Since Poetry Matters is based at McGill, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is situated on unceded Indigenous lands on the traditional territory of the Ganyankahaga, one of the founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Ganyankahaga are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jajaga, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So I'll begin by offering a brief introduction and a sense of where this session is coming from. Founded in 2018 by Joel Peters and Adrian Foster, who are composers and organists, Earthworld Collaborative brings together people working in a range of disciplines and media, such as music, the visual arts, video and film, literature, and philosophy. And one of the goals this evening is to probe a bit about what collaborative work and perhaps collaborative play has been like for the group over time and through different projects, and how the experience of collaboration has changed recently during COVID. So Poetry Matters has invited them to collaborate on this discussion to elaborate on collaborative process and creative process by their lights. So I'll mention that their experimental projects have often been installations, and they'll say more about that this evening. They're multimedia experiences. Often they've been situated in church spaces in Montreal, and they seek to create environments that engage many different senses at once. Often creating a through line for their work are philosophical themes or problematics, and sometimes what I have felt as thought experiments, but perhaps you can say more about that this evening. One of their projects that I experienced was held in a church space, for instance, where we watched cloudscapes projected on a vaulted ceiling, which was really compelling. Another made us feel, because of fluid images that were flowing on the walls, that we were underwater. And one thing that I've found fascinating about your work is that those of us in the audience often feel removed from our ordinary element and placed into a new one. And I remember the first project of theirs that I encountered and participated in was an installation inspired by the Ash Wednesday service, which included the poetry of Eliot, of T.S. Eliot, his poem Ash Wednesday. And I'll just say that I was riveted by the environment that you created, which again involved projections on the walls and ceiling, which called to mind flames and ashes. There was a soundscape involving haunting music. And then there were voices offering meditations inspired both by the concept of Ash Wednesday and T.S. Eliot's poem. So I remember all of that vividly. And I'll mention that I always wanted to experience Eliot's poem outside an academic context, in a space and in a way that brought out more fully than a classroom experience can, the different dimensions of what the poetry feels like. Its sound, its visual images, its incantatory rhythms, and the atmosphere that you created did this richly. So as a gambit for tonight's conversation, since our group obviously works with poetry, we've been especially interested in hearing about the role played by poetry over time in your thinking and in your creative process. Since we've also shared this with Adrian and Joel, one further note I'll offer is that the Poetry Matters initiative has been thinking about transformations during pandemic by way of the concept of emergence. That's our theme for the year, and I know some of you will be speaking to that this evening. We've used the idea of emergence to mark times when we feel that we're in the midst of innovations emerging from the lived experience of pandemic. So in other words, when do we feel that something new, something really new, to use a phrase from T.S. Eliot, has emerged from new conditions, such as new practices or even new paradigms and new approaches? And so that is our prompt to you for this conversation. What has Earthworld felt has emerged newly in your own practice and your work over this past year? So before I pass things along to Adrian and Joel, the three areas of questions that Poetry Matters has been thinking about together with Earthworld are these. First of all, again, how has Earthworld found itself responding and adapting to conditions of pandemic? What has that been like? What role poetry, as you conceive of it, and the poetic, what role do these play in the work of Earthworld? And then how do you find the group conceptualizes collaboration? How do you think about the process of collaboration with its many dimensions? And I'll end by saying that some work that I did years back on theories of collaboration came to mind as we were talking about this, and I was very aware that there's often a kind of romance associated with the idea of collaboration. And yet when it actually comes to collaborating, it is often a lot of work and a lot of fun, but it takes a lot of doing that goes beyond that initial sense of play. So interested to hear your impressions along these lines. There will be some time for questions at the end, and what I'll say to people who have stopped in is that you're also welcome to thread in comments and questions to me privately in the chat as we go, and we can include those as we talk. So thank you very much. Let me pass things along to Adrian and Joel and others.
Thank you so much, Miranda. So glad to be a part of this. Thanks for organizing it, and thank you for inviting us and for that introduction. So before I really say much of anything, what I'd like to do is actually just play a video for everyone, just so you can get a little bit of a feel for the kinds of things that we do. So this is a video that's kind of a year in review of our projects from 2019, so before the pandemic kind of disrupted things a bit. And it's just about a minute long, so I'm just going to share my screen and do that. So just in a nutshell, just a few of the activities, just so you can kind of get a little visual idea of things. And I'm going to say just a couple of words about the collaborative, and then a sort of case study of one of our projects to sort of show the general kind of working concept. And then Joel's going to talk a bit after that about the role of poetry. So the collaborative, as Miranda mentioned, was launched in 2018, and actually almost exactly 3 years ago, it was in February 2018 that we had our first concert, which was called Music for the Hydro Organon. And that's what I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about. Since then, the collaborative has continued to evolve and grow and expand in all kinds of different ways. And I have to say, we're just so lucky to have all of the amazing people, both here in Montreal and across Canada and around the world who've been a part of the projects that we've done and made this all happen. And I look forward today, especially from hearing from a lot of the collaborators who were involved in our latest project that was aired just a few weeks ago. So what we do tends to revolve heavily around something that we've termed immersive story concerts. And these are live events that integrate things like electronics, original compositions, different kinds of visual effects like projection, lighting, other special effects, and I would say sort of world building, as it were, concerts that revolve around a kind of story and narrative and that create this kind of large world which we can play with for other events and for what we call satellite projects. And this idea of satellite projects is really important to what we do because it's not just focused on the live concert events, but it's focused on this whole web of projects that are inspired by that also in turn inspire future concert events or future video projects or you know, poetry collaborations, you name it. So these can take the form of all kinds of disciplines and all kinds of possibilities. So we've done things with short stories, with essays, with short films, with dance, with photo exhibits, with installations, et cetera. And we're kind of pretty much open to any kind of possibilities that will let the projects and the ideas behind them speak. So what I'd like to focus in on just for a moment is our first concert project, Music for the Hydro Organon. This was the one that we did in February 2018, and we actually revisited with a kind of revised version in October of 2019. So in this case, the germ of the idea was actually a short story that Joel and another one of our collaborators, Andre Forget, collaborated on before Earthworld was actually formed. And so it was this short story called The Lower Registers, which is a sort of fantastical, but also kind of pseudo-historical account of underwater pipe organs. And these are instruments that don't actually exist, and in fact, probably couldn't exist in the real world. But the story is kind of crafted in such a way that you get this technical history and theory behind it, almost as if you find yourself second guessing whether it's real or whether it's fiction. And I think that kind of blurring of the boundaries between reality and fiction, at least for me, plays a huge role in the interest behind a lot of these projects that we do. So in this story, it's kind of a first-person account from a journalist who's going to investigate a new underwater organ that's being built in Halifax Harbor. And the idea is people are constructing these massive underwater instruments, and tourists are flocking to visit and hear concerts, and they go scuba diving and hear these concerts underwater. And for some of them, it's just this cheap gimmick that people are throwing their money away on. But for others, they hear these concerts and they have these profound, life-changing kind of divine experiences. So when Earthworld was formed, we thought, you know, how can we go even deeper into this world, this short story that already existed with Joel and Andre's collaboration? What could we do to create some kind of event, to create other projects around that? And naturally, what came to mind was, what if we presented a concert as if we were actually underwater and listening to an underwater organ concert? So what would the instruments sound like? What kind of music would they play? What kind of atmosphere can you create? And how can you do this in a concert space, in a live physical building, in this case, a church? So we use organ and electronics. Both Joel and I are organists, and one of the ways we got involved in collaborating was through this mutual interest in sort of expanding the organ sound world with electronics, augmenting it in a way. And so that's a tool then to kind of create this underwater effect, to modify the sounds of the acoustic instrument and give this feeling that it could be taking place underwater. And we use kind of immersive lighting with these ripple effect kind of lights, and also a bubble machine that was actually kind of spraying bubbles out into the audience at a climactic moment in the concert. And even going as far as inviting a couple of our friends who were very nice to do so, to wear kind of full scuba gear, like with the tanks and everything, and wander around in the concert space as if they were the divers actually listening to the music. And I think one of the things that I also found really interesting about this, and that when I mentioned before this blurring of the lines between reality and fiction, is we presented this event as a conference celebrating the 1-year anniversary of this organ that was built in Halifax, the organ that doesn't exist. And one of our good friends who was there, who's actually from not far from Halifax, came up after the concert and said, you know, I never heard of this organ. I didn't realize, when was it built and where? And didn't realize that the entire thing was made up. And so I really love that. So in terms of this idea of satellite projects and all these collaborative possibilities of a project, one of the things that we did was we said we want to invite poets to create poetic contributions that reflect in words and text what the experience of listening to these organs would be like. But we said we don't want to just have the poems and the music. We want to actually have the two really influencing each other. And so we actually had the poems kind of commissioned first, and then we composed the music to reflect the poetry and had some back and forth with the authors of the poems, so that there's this mutual exchange where everything is kind of benefiting one another, or everything is influencing one another. And I think that's an important element when we're talking about this collaborative process, is that everything is interconnected in this way. It's not just that the music leads into a deeper understanding of the poetry, but the poetry opens up possibilities for the music and et cetera, with all of the other elements of the projects. And I would say that's one of the big goals of this collaborative, of what we do, is kind of imbuing a kind of meaning into the experience of listening to music, into the experience of creating art and experiencing art, both from the creator's perspective and from the audience's perspective. And so ever since that project, we've gone on to do, I think, about a dozen or so live events, and many dozens of video projects and written projects, and et cetera. And that continues to kind of shape how we work. And of course, then one of the challenges that we'll discuss in just a moment with our latest project is how to adapt a model that's built around immersive concert experiences when we can't have actual in-person concerts. So I'm going to hand it over then to Joel, who's going to talk a bit about the role of poetry and some other things.
Yeah, so poetry, I'm going to speak. Essentially, poetry has a pretty essential role with Earthworld, and it goes farther than just being something that we like. Essentially, as Adrian mentioned, that it adds these extra dimensions to projects, that it's never purely a concert. There's always either poetry being read, or in the case with the underwater organ story, is essentially that we composed music as if it was underwater, but we also wanted to have this other view onto the story as well. And so by bringing in extra poets, including Sarah Enns, who's here with us, was to basically get a view of the story that was not our own, and to be able to start from this other view and get music into other places to essentially add more dimensions to each project. And this has been an essential role that has continued to play also into the Ash Wednesday project, where we were not only reading the poems, but also the poem structured the entire installation as well, and which also formed this sort of inspiration for the meditations on these, which are more on the academic side. So the poetry either basically fills out a project, creates more inspiration for things, structures things, and part of the reason just because poetry and their images are just so full of ways that you can use music for them. Like, yeah, and I don't want to say much more than that other than those 4 or 5 things that poetry can do. Yeah, that's all I want to say for that.
So, Joel, at this point, should we move to other members of the collaborative for some further thoughts about music from silence, in particular, that project?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and basically, yeah, let's just go straight to there, I think. Yeah, so the Music from Silence project was essentially, well, a lot of artist programs and organizations had to adapt to not having concerts. And so what do you do when you don't have a concert in real life? And so Adrian and I discussed, along with another of musicians and artists, like what would an Earth World concert look like? And basically we sort of summarized a state of the situation was that there was a ton of virtual concerts happening, which were essentially just videos of performances happening. And this had been happening for years. It's nothing new. And in fact, Eric Whitaker's virtual choir premiered like over 10 years ago. So that wasn't new. And we like to do new things at Earthworld. So, and also, but the biggest new thing was that the musicians were just feeling so distraught and like this absence of I perform for the internet, and then why do I feel so lacking in something? And so the lacking becomes into this other theme of absence and silence that basically everybody is feeling in the streets. There's no cars, there's no people, there's no noise really. So we have lack of audience participation, we have this silence, and we still like, how do we work with the audience like this since we can't get there? So basically then Sarah and I worked through essentially like what is so palpable about silence and what is so palpable about absence. Like, why does it matter so much to us? So basically we sort of went through a number of ways silence and absence happens. And one of the most palpable ways is, of course, the death of a loved one, or like your significant other leaves. And when they're gone, you literally have to change your perspective on the world. The possibilities that you have to engage with are no longer there. And this is, as Alain Badiou would say, is the view of two in terms of relationship. Often they talk about man and woman coming together as one, but he thinks that relationships are essentially the view of two. You're now looking at the world through a second perspective. And so this then goes into the performance side of things, where it's fine, you can read aloud poetry by yourself in your room, but when you put another person in there and you're reading to another person, all of a sudden there's a lot of different things that happen. And I don't want to go into too many of those details right now, but essentially that's this big absence of an audience that we were working with, and the musicians were feeling that terribly as well. So with all of those things happening together, we basically wanted to bring the audience participation back somehow, even if it was only symbolically. And the time, yeah. So the idea was, let's include the audience in the music making by having them physically have to be in the space. This will be either through pre-recorded or live. We went with pre-recorded, but they would have to sit down in a room and watch this thing on the internet for an hour, which is a huge ask for the things that are on the internet these days. But it's also a huge ask to get somebody to a concert. So in order to get these people to a concert, we tried to make a fun video for it. So then Adrian, the Be There video was sort of a call for participants to come to our virtual concert.
We miss you.
We really miss you.
On s'ennuie de toi aux salles de concert.
We miss playing music for you guys.
We miss being there with the music.
Let's make music again. Join us for an Earthworld concert suited for quarantine life.
A virtual concert where you can be there.
Be there. There.
Or there. Okay, so here's how you can be there. Film yourself watching the concert from home, then live stream that video to YouTube. Seem complicated? Don't worry. Click the link below and we'll tell you everything you need to know.
Now everybody is different and everybody is in a different situation.
Or maybe you live in New York.
Россия.
Mexico. Maybe you live in a house.
Maybe you have a camera.
Well, I have a good camera here. I've got pure native ISO. I have a focal reducer.
Maybe all you've got is your cell phone camera and the lighting isn't very good.
Maybe you have good lighting.
Or bad lighting.
Maybe you're a superhero.
Maybe you have a dog, a cat,
Bird.
A glass of wine.
pizza,
A nice dress.
Or maybe you need to get dressed.
Whatever your situation.
Click on the link in the description and we'll help you be there for Earthworld's first virtual concert. See ya!
So that was the idea, to have the audience be present in the performance space as well. And the idea was also that since so many of these videos online were this performance-centric way of viewing art, as basically you consume art, so there's no need for the audience to be there. But we had different ideas. And Gerald, if you're there.
Hi.
Yeah. So basically the Be There was the fun version of the deeply serious philosophical reasons for actually putting in the audience into the performance space. And as far as I know, this is still the first project that has included the audience with this much intention. And partly the reason why is because it's a lot of work. So anyway, so Gerald and I began ruminating on the philosophical foundations for this, and then Gerald sort of went as deep as he possibly could into the importance of the audience in performing and music making. So Gerald, if you want to talk about that essay.
Yeah, so I guess what I'll say is that the genesis of, the genesis of this essay in my thinking was a certain horror almost at the way that debates around coronavirus responses have been framed, and you sort of have like you have like people who really are concerned about this thing called economy on one side, and people who are really concerned about this thing called health on the other side, and that's sort of everything else gets squeezed out. And what I wasn't hearing and still don't really is concerns about how the kinds of isolation we expect from each other, and particularly isolation of our bodies from one another is it's unraveling to who we are as embodied social beings at its core. And that's not just, maybe it's, I don't want to get into whether that it might still be necessary for us to get into the distancing now. I mean, that's a different conversation. I don't want to get into that, but just the fact that it wasn't being addressed. And if it was, it would maybe be addressed as this separate thing called mental health, as like a side concern that then you can treat on its own, and not something that is, again, like unraveling of what it means to be human together with each other, to be there with each other. And part of that is so then Joel's comments about audience became, in some respects, an excuse for me to use this frame to try to reflect more deeply on some of those thoughts. And one of the nice things about Joel and Adrian around this collaborative is they don't just come to you with like, okay, we have this big vision and we want you to fill in this piece here. They have broad sketches, almost like a very loosely sketched, jazz board that then you can really fill in your own piece and push a piece where you want it to go. And so I think part of what I saw myself as wanting to push in terms of this project was in the opening, the question was, how is Earthworld adapting to these conditions? And part of what I wanted to say is, I don't think Earthworld can adapt to these conditions, but we can't adapt to these conditions and make it in a sort of compelling way. And that statement of our inability to adapt and an act of lament alongside that adaptation then becomes what maybe we can do in and under these restrictions. Yeah, that's what I'll say for now, unless somebody wants to prod me for more in some regard.
I'll just jump in, having listened to all of you and thinking about that impact of isolation that we've all felt. I feel that very powerfully as you describe that, because the way that isolation affects us as you say, as embodied social beings is major. And sometimes it seems to open up opportunities for new kinds of play as we all scramble to find ways to connect. But sometimes it hits us as you say, as a palpable absence that we can't but lament. So yeah, so I'm very struck by everything that you're saying. I have in my notes something from Sarah on manifestos that you were developing for Music from Silence. Am I right in remembering that your part of this was developing a manifesto for the project?
Well, yeah, so yeah, Joel basically emailed me and said, this is something that we're thinking about. We're trying to envision this concert idea in the midst of a pandemic. And I've written some ideas about that, and I'm wondering if you can sort of jump in on that. So basically we together worked in this manifesto of, why is this silence impacting us the way it is, and how can we possibly create in the midst of that silence? And we came up with this idea of like an envelope almost of something to hold the silence, or something that that music can come out of. And so we thought maybe this virtual concert could be this envelope. And not only that, but that silence, that performing something, the audience's silence, but being there to produce that listening active silence is what's so missing from speaking into a screen or just recording something. And so that was the envelope idea, was that we could maybe find a way to manufacture this like present silent audience that is providing an envelope for the performances. And the other piece that I did for the concert was Joel and Adrian invited me to write a poem as well. And that's one of my favorite parts about collaborating with Earthworld, or collaborating in general, is sometimes, I never would have thought to write a poem about underwater organ, but now suddenly that idea has been sparked for me. Or in the case, dealing with this, with COVID, that's such to that point, I hadn't been able to really think of the words to express the experience of the silence and the isolation, and a pandemic in general is just hyper object that's so hard to get thoughts and words and ideas around. But because now I've been invited to sort of write into that, that kind of opened a way to articulate something that I wanted to say. And I also think that, speaking about poetry particularly, poetry so often is able to express what is not expressible. It can kind of put a language to things that are so difficult to think about even, or convey. So I found that really exciting. I don't know, I have the poem, which I can read. Would now be a good time? Okay. Okay, yeah, so this is the poem that I wrote after sort of working on this manifesto, thinking about silence, trying to put words to this experience. And the poem is called What Sounds Are Left. For 2 days straight, the man who lives above me sang to Sigur Rós full volume. I lay in my bed looking up, thought the wailing felt so good, like even the air was brokenhearted. Sometimes I hear him sneeze, whir his microwave to life, and stamp his floor, my ceiling. Before, the waves of Icelandic ambiance came to define our lives, I'd bridge the silence playing Bach for my cat to calm her. Didn't make any difference. She'd skitter walls, leap countertops, and finally settle. Not the arias, but some inner force yielding her to stillness, to knowing, her tail a comma on carpet. Now that the Sigur Rós has stopped, I tried to take lodging in what sounds are left. The ones that rise like foam swathing riverbank, tangling reeds, a vacuum down the hall, fizz of fridge, cat crooning. Through the window, goose, magpie, sparrow, pigeon, chickadee especially, their hopes in 2 notes bobbing. Sometimes I'm afraid I've placed too much meaning in names, afraid I'll break the quiet wrong. COVID rearranged spells see void, like see the void, like look now at the hole at the center of us. A friend texts, how many days since you've been outside? So I leave my apartment and flinch along the river, startled by cyclists, by my desire to touch, even hold, someone's face very close to mine. Sometimes I'm afraid to be alone in the silence because what will I hear? Back home there is nothing, words unfleshed, the thick hush harbored in me. And Carson says, there is a place inside a word where it falls silent in its own presence. Pandemic, I say, listening. Above me, the man drops something heavy and swears, his shout shattering. Silence, once broken, opens wide, tears from my own throat.
That was amazing, Sarah. Yeah, especially the moment of bringing us to listening to the word pandemic and the silence within that word. I'll just comment by saying that during the first days of the pandemic, which is what your poem just brought me to, I was thinking a lot about how we all were listening differently to sounds in the environment. That's what some of your details were bringing back. And I was often struck by the subtlety of sounds that we were able to hear and listen to that ordinarily would be drowned out, as though something was uncovered, fortunately, so that, in that that period of what felt so much like absence, as Gerald, you were saying, lamentable absence, there was also this sense of discovery of new presences, so that we could hear those delicate sounds from a distance as ordinarily we we wouldn't have been able to. And I kept thinking about a pair of phrases from Wallace Stevens, the poet Wallace Stevens, ghostlier demarcations and keener sounds, from the idea of order at Key West, as though we had been tossed into a different sound world of keener sounds and more delicate sounds. So that's some of what your poem brought across. So I will pass things along to another member of Earthworld, Jessica. May I point to you at this point? Because I have in my notes that that you're bringing across another dimension of collaborative work. So let me pass things on to you.
Right, thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here. So I'm the cellist that you can hear on Voices of Silence. And my invitation to collaborate with Earthworld came it was very random and serendipitous, and came at a pretty pivotal point in my life. Like many other people, I was really struggling to cope with the conditions of COVID-19. All my concerts as a freelance cellist had been canceled, and my doctoral coursework had moved online. And at age 26, I found myself moving in back with my parents in Seattle at my family home. And I was pretty lost, and the invitation to work on this really gave me a sense of direction. It was a very unique opportunity in that I had gotten my brother on board. He's doing some of the film, and we were sharing a house together. And so we were able to work with Joel, Miranda, and Nick, who were, I think you guys were all probably in Montreal at the time, which is, as you know, in normal circumstances, if you're performing a concert with somebody, you have to be usually together on the same stage. You have to make sure you're all in the same city. So that was a very unique experience. And it also really provided me with this chance to personally connect with a network of musicians and artists and other people who I don't think I would have met in normal circumstances, who have kind of come together through this shared dedication to bringing people together through art and music. So with that being said, do you want to play the clip?
Is a world of silence implicated in our lives. By breaking the silence, language realizes what the silence wished and did not obtain.
Awesome. So the original concept for this project was to have the text be the centerpiece and for the music to kind of ornament things here and there. But Joel was pretty vague when he reached out to me about this opportunity, and either I got carried away or misunderstood Joel, and I wrote, or I guess I recorded a full-length piece that became kind of more of the centerpiece, and then the text was ornamenting the music, and all of this was accompanied by the beautiful film. And I'm realizing now that it's all part of the genius of what Earthworld does. Is they're intentionally vague, I think, when they're talking to collaborators, so that because there's no one leader, and Joel had not asked me specifically what to do, which I'm used to very much. And you know, as a professional musician, I'm used to being directly asked to complete some sort of task. But I think in this situation, we didn't know what the product was until we had finally arrived at the product. And so basically, like, the way that this works is that Earthworld has to create these conditions that are conducive to collaboration. And I found that the way that they successfully do this is through really creating this environment where you can truly trust each other as artists, bounce back ideas from one another, constantly devise and adapt. And it was pretty special, in my opinion, that was something we were able to do with 2 people working from Seattle and the rest working from Montreal. Definitely something that is unique to this time, and maybe something that wouldn't have been able to happen if there wasn't this global crisis going on right now. We also all really had to keep an open mind when somebody presented kind of a new element to the project. Then each one of us had to adapt our end of things, and our end of things kind of didn't exist. Like, it all was just this like stew of a bunch of ideas, and minds were kept so open, in fact, that there was one point in which Joel had mentioned that he kind of wished that there were more like swamp shots or marshes or something, but there was perhaps not enough time to get that. And I thought, hey, my 20-year-old brother is living in the same house as me. He's a film student at UW. Maybe he can do this. And it was pretty great that Joel and the rest of the collaborators put their trust in my baby brother, who ended up getting this amazing mentorship from Nick, who was someone who was already really esteemed in that field, and was able to really help nurture my brother and help him find something really special. So I mean, it was really fantastic. I got to genuinely connect with a whole bunch of other artists, and I felt like I learned so much about poetry and philosophy and film. And I realized that they're all things that are really important to me, that I needed, and I didn't know I needed it. And I hope that's something, and I believe it is something that we convey to the audience, is we show them these different sides of art that they don't know that they liked yet, maybe, and then they're able to see how they can interact with each other so beautifully and so fluidly, and it turns into something really special. So yeah.
I find I'm responding strongly to what you've said about the serendipitous and about the openness that Earthworld creates in collaborative process for letting things emerge. I'll use that idea in a different way. I'll turn that idea that there has to be that kind of room for things to evolve and emerge. And I'm landing a lot on what you've suggested about trust in that collaborative setting, where people are trusting one another to run with ideas. Yeah. Well, thank you. So let me turn to Kim. I see Kim here on another part of my screen. Kim, I have in my notes that you have something to say about the role of poetry again, because that's something that you do as part of your work for the collaborative.
Yeah, first of all, sorry I'm in the dark. I moved on Monday and I just discovered I need to get a lamp. So I'm here, I'm just in the shadow.
There were those comments earlier about good lighting, bad lighting, no lighting.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for having me. I've worked with Earthworld several times now on a lot of these similar themes of like emerging, changing, growing multimedia pieces. And this one was interesting, actually. My situation is pretty similar to Jessica's. I moved home with family for the pandemic as well, but and I'm usually very extroverted, and I do a lot of collaborative works with people in workshop settings where we like build the piece together in person, bounce things back like in real time. And I found that was not at all, I was like not creating, and I was just like depressed, and I felt repressed at home, like not being able to be so creative, and I'm too loud, I'm too much, like all this stuff. So I found myself going for retreats, and I'm also an arborist, tree climber. So the day that you guys wrote to me, I had just been like sitting in my front yard tree at the top looking at a rainbow, and I wrote this little angsty poem about a rainbow. And I had all these like questions and philosophical ideas that I was just like, that's how I was finding peace. And then, yeah, so then I like came down out of the tree, and then you guys said you were doing this project. And then I remembered my friend Ethan had written a piece for organ, or he was working on it. And we talked a bit about, because I'm a composer, but I do visual art and different themes. And so we had already spoken about one day doing an in-person installation with, because the way the tonality works in the piece is that it's based off of these mixtures and kind of like color theory of colors mixing and things turning to different hues or different shades. And we were going to do it with these big sculptural discs that were going to move in the space. And then another time I went, my piano teacher like let me house sit for her because she knew I was having a hard time staying with my family. So I went there, and she had this beautiful stained glass window that was covered in these little colorful gemstones that you can get at the dollar store. And so I was just videotaping it on my phone, and then all this cool stuff happened with the lights. And so then that kind of became the inspiration for the video. And then I just played around with it, and all those things came. So maybe you just show the clip, Adrian. Yeah, so I just, I guess the thing about collaboration during pandemic is that it's more that you have moments to check in with each other, because Ethan was in Calgary, I'm in Ottawa now, these guys are in Montreal, and we were all just kind of sending things back and forth, and there's the delay, which I actually found interesting, because then you have a moment to think about it, whereas in person I feel like you just react quick time, and then you're like feeding off of each other, and sometimes that's great, but then it's also been really interesting to see what happens if there's like a day of lag, or if yeah. And there was another project that we did before, it actually happened right before pandemic at Nuit Blanche, and that piece has been changing ever since, but the score has poetry and stuff in it as well. And I've been working with my organ teacher in Victoria on it now, and sending him videos of the score. I don't know, I just find it's interesting when you're not there, you somehow work differently, even though it's still a communication back and forth. You say different things, you think of different things, and you have to prepare it in a way that it's easy to get online. So then somehow you can't just like throw it together and give it to someone. It's a little bit more thoughtful, but in a different way. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling. I'll just stop.
I'm really landing this time on the importance of what you just said about checking in with one another, and how that's a different process now, how it's very hard to do at first because you have to learn new ways of doing it, new dance steps. But I'm also really taken by what you suggested about the fortunate effects of latency. I think that's what it's called, right? That delay effect, if I'm understanding. Yeah, because I think, most people I know have just been rubbed the wrong way and expressing irritation about that. But you're so right that it gives you an extra moment so that the interaction can happen differently and people can reflect for a moment in a way that they ordinarily wouldn't. So that really, really interesting. So at this point, why don't I open things to others who might have comments or questions, even either from within Earthworld or people who are here from Poetry Matters. Does anybody have any comment or question that you want to bring back to Earthworld about anything that we've been talking about?
I do want to say just a quick thing about, because we had, to save time, we kind of skipped over a little bit of the collaborative process kind of thing, but the basic idea of how to get sort of everybody creating and with a coherent idea is essentially people kind of have to be on the same page to kind of begin with. So this was part of the reason why Sarah and I crafted this manifesto so delicately, that so that everybody has the same idea. Okay, what are the themes we're working with? Absence, silence, this kind of thing. So we try to be the sort of, the ultimate kernel of the idea is very specific, but to have that, as people have been saying, like specific with ways to move around that. Yeah,
could I ask you and Sarah to elaborate on further on what that manifesto involved? Because I found I wasn't catching that quite. And I'm thinking about just the energy and the urgency and the the directionality associated with manifestos. You were thinking of it as a way to draw the group together for the collaborative work. But it was a manifesto for seizing the moment, seizing the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, one of my, again, to bring back Beju again, is that manifestos come at pivotal moments where something needs to be said to sort of start again. And having all of these new things happening at the same time and not happening, silence, absence, all of these things, to try to articulate, take state of the situation so that you can reorganize yourself and sort of create new things. And I can only sort of go so far to say, like, I can sort of, these are the helpful things, but Sarah was also really good at pulling out the ideas. And maybe Sarah, you want to, like, the very first draft that I sent was definitely sort of rambly, trying to find the words, and your sort of experience of that, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's also the process of trying to state any idea clearly is can be difficult, but especially when the idea is something like this, where it's like we've never really faced an experience like this. So how do we talk about it? How do we try to create something within it? So I read kind of what Joel had written, and I was like, okay, I kind of see what this is all about. And then I ended up talking to Gerald, who's my brother, so that was easy. And Gerald was kind of like, okay, I think that this might be what he's trying to say. And I was like, aha, okay, got it. So then I was able to sort of like, okay, like then we need a sentence that kind of very clearly says that there are different, and what it's all about, right, is all about grappling with this concept of silence. So on the one hand, the silence is deafening and it's shutting us down, and it's and like Joel was saying before, there's this silence that occurs from absence when someone that you love has left your life, or someone has passed away, or whatever it might be, or in this case, a global pandemic, right? So there's this huge sense of absence, but we also wanted to talk about this other kind of silence that we were really missing, which was the silence of a rapt audience, the silence of people being there and participating, like the silence was participatory. So we had to sort of figure out a way to craft the manifesto to both talk about these two different types of silences, and then how to, in the midst of this overwhelming sort of despairing silence, create a virtual concert that that allows an audience to provide that participatory silence. Does that,
Yeah. Well, and also the part of the helpful thing with working with Sarah on this one was also that there was a definite realization after the first draft came back that's like, okay, Sarah has a lot of tools that I don't have. She can talk about moments in time in probably 100 different ways, whereas I kind of just say moment. And then I just say moment sort of a whole bunch of times, but then there are ways that poetry can talk about moments in all these different ways that sort of springs off into other directions. Like, oh yeah, now we can talk about this one. And so then that was one that I just couldn't do. And to bring that side of, anyway, I could go on, but.
So what made it advance was bringing together the two idioms. And yeah, and I mean, it strikes me that this is part of letting things emerge and letting meaning emerge gradually. That, you know, first there's this experience of something that feels vaguer, and then it gains an outline and gains focus as you go along. All right, so one further thing that I'll say in response is that I really love the concept that I think, Sarah, you introduced initially about the audience as envelope. You made that analogy, right? So when you were talking about the palpable silence of, or the palpable energy or presence of an audience. So I would ask you then, what made your mind go to that word for capturing the effect of audience, the felt sense of audience?
So that image was from Joel's sort of original. I think that was right in the very first draft that Joel sent to me, and this word envelope. And then because I guess I work in like imagery and metaphor, I was like, perfect. Okay, so I really like latched onto that as like, this is what's going to drive this manifesto, right? This compelling metaphor of the image of the envelope. And yeah, I guess this idea that that an audience provides a holding or a way of the response is to sort of make a container for this experience in a way, and also a communal like holding. So that was the idea that we wanted to sort of, or that was the metaphor that we were working with. And then through fleshing it out, we thought this like virtual audience that is recorded there might do some of that enveloping work.
Holding together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I will draw things to a close because we're coming up, as I say, on our boundary of an hour. But thank you all for this glimpse into what it's like to work together. And one further thing that occurred to me as you were talking is that maybe if we talk in terms not of adaptation but evolution, something different happens in the way that it feels as we think about it. Because I'm remembering what you mentioned earlier, Gerald, about not feeling as though it was possible to adapt, or even that we necessarily wanted to adapt to what's happening, which is so hard on so many levels. But there are ways in which we're also waking up newly with creative process and with relationships. You know, this is what we've been talking about, creating relationships to create art and otherwise. And perhaps those are some of the new possibilities that are making it hard, but also something generative as well. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming tonight. And I hope we can continue the conversation and look forward to future work from Earthworld. I guess we can always check out your website to see what's in the offing and what's on the horizon. And please send news of what's happening at this point and what's happening next. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.